The first thing Daniel noticed when he opened his eyes that morning was the emptiness beside him. The bed felt larger than it used to, too wide, too hollow, as though the warmth that once filled it had long evaporated. Laura had left early again, a neatly folded note on the table, breakfast in the fridge. Meeting at 9. Love you. Her handwriting was soft, practiced, and distant. Daniel read it twice, not because he missed her words, but because he needed to feel something. The silence of their apartment pressed against him like fog, thick, unspoken, and strangely polite. Marriage, he had come to realize, did not end with arguments or slammed doors. Sometimes it dissolved quietly, like sugar in cold water. You kept stirring, hoping sweetness would return, but all that remained was the motion itself. That evening, his flight to the city left precisely on time. Daniel liked punctuality. It was proof that something still worked the way it was supposed to. The airport was crowded with familiar strangers, faces blurred by routine. He carried only one bag and a tired smile that felt mechanical. The hotel, modest but neat, stood in the quieter part of downtown. Its walls smelled faintly of disinfectant and nostalgia, like a place that tried hard to stay relevant but had long accepted its solitude. Daniel had stayed there twice before for work, and each time it had greeted him with the same dull welcome, a polite receptionist, a sterile lobby, and a room too clean to feel lived in. He dropped his bag on the bed and loosened his tie. The city light seeped through the curtains, drawing pale lines across the floor. For a long time, he just stood there, staring at the glow and listening to the low hum of traffic below. Later, he found himself at the hotel bar, a narrow, dimly lit space tucked behind the lobby. He wasn't a drinker, but tonight he ordered a glass of whiskey, hoping its warmth would quiet the noise in his head. A few businessmen murmured in the corner, a couple laughed too loudly, and the bartender polished the same glass over and over. That's when he appeared. Mind if I sit here? The voice was calm, self-assured, and touched with something unguarded. Daniel turned and met the eyes of a man, early 30s, maybe younger, his dark hair slightly disheveled, his smile both kind and knowing. Sure, Daniel replied, shifting slightly. I'm Adrian, the stranger said, extending a hand. Daniel. Adrian ordered a gin and tonic, then gestured toward Daniel's drink. Whiskey on a work night. Brave choice. Daniel smirked faintly. Just trying to remember what being human feels like. Adrian laughed softly, a sound too genuine for a stranger. That's the most honest thing I've heard all week. For a while, their conversation stayed harmless: travel, work, the city's erratic weather. But beneath the ordinary words, something else stirred, an ease Daniel hadn't felt in years. Adrian spoke with an openness that made silence comfortable. He didn't fill the air to impress, he simply existed in it, gently, like someone who had nothing left to prove. When Adrian mentioned, almost offhandedly, that he lived nearby and worked in design, Daniel felt a faint shift inside himself. Then came the small confession, simple, unembellished. I should say this before it comes up later, Adrian said. I'm gay. Not sure if that makes you uncomfortable. Daniel hesitated. No, it doesn't. He meant it. And yet, something in him trembled, not from fear, but from awareness. Adrian smiled faintly. Good. You'd be surprised how many people suddenly find an urgent call to make after that sentence. Daniel chuckled. I'm not one of them. Their laughter lingered between them, soft and unforced. The conversation drifted to deeper things: loneliness, connection, the small tragedies that come with growing older. Daniel found himself speaking more than he intended, confessing the quiet parts of his life he rarely shared, how marriage had become mechanical, how he missed being seen without explanation. Adrian listened, not like someone waiting to respond, but like someone hearing. As the hour grew late, Daniel noticed the bar thinning out. The bartender dimmed the lights further, signaling closing time. Neither man seemed eager to move. Eventually, Adrian glanced at his watch. I should let you rest. Big day tomorrow. Meetings, Daniel said, though his thoughts were elsewhere. Adrian nodded, smiling faintly. Maybe I'll see you around. Maybe. When Daniel returned to his room, the stillness felt heavier than before. He stood by the window again, looking down at the glowing city. Somewhere below, Adrian might still be walking, confident, unguarded, free. Daniel pressed his hand against the glass, watching his reflection blur into the night lights. For the first time in years, he felt something stir, not passion, not even temptation, but aliveness, and that, he knew, was dangerous. Morning arrived without mercy. The storm had passed, leaving a stillness that pressed against the house like a secret refusing to fade. I woke to sunlight spilling across the room, too bright, too honest. The air carried the faint scent of wine and something heavier, guilt. Maybe. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the half-empty glasses on the table. The events of the night replayed in my mind like a film I didn't remember agreeing to watch. Ryan's words, "You'll understand one day," echoed until they lost their meaning. Down the hall, I heard voices. Laughter. Familiar, casual, easy, as though nothing had happened. I followed the sound to the kitchen, every step slower than the one before. Ryan was frying eggs, humming a tune under his breath. Leo sat at the counter, scrolling through his phone. When he saw me, his expression shifted, first surprise, then something close to shame. "Morning," Ryan said brightly, not looking up. "Coffee's fresh." I stared at him, waiting for the apology that never came. "That's it? After last night?" He turned, spatula in hand, eyebrows raised as if I'd interrupted a normal morning. "What do you want me to say?" "The truth," I said. "Why? Why did you plan it?" Ryan set the pan aside, his smile fading. "You needed to feel something again, Ethan. You've been walking around like a ghost for months. I thought, maybe if you remembered what it was like to be wanted." I cut in. "That wasn't about wanting. That was manipulation." Leo stood, his voice low. "He's right, Ryan. It wasn't fair." Ryan's jaw tightened. "You're the one who went along with it." Leo flinched, then looked at me. "I didn't mean for it to go that far. At first, I thought it was just a way to cheer you up, but then," he stopped, shaking his head. "I started to care. That wasn't supposed to happen." I wanted to believe him, but every word felt like another thread in the same web. "You both decided what I needed without asking me," I said quietly. "Do you know what that feels like? To have your pain turned into someone else's project?" Ryan leaned against the counter, folding his arms. "You're overreacting. Nothing happened that you didn't allow." The sentence hit like a slap. Consent twisted into justification that I stepped back, heart pounding. "You don't get to decide what I allowed. You made me feel safe, and then used that against me." For the first time, Ryan's confidence cracked. He looked away, muttering something under his breath I couldn't catch. Leo reached for my arm, but I moved before he could touch me. "I'm leaving," I said. "Ethan," Leo started, but I shook my head. "Don't. Whatever you think this was, it wasn't real." I went back to the guest room, packing my things with trembling hands. Every item that went into the bag felt heavier than it should have, as though the air itself resisted letting me leave. When I turned, Leo stood at the doorway, hesitant, guilt written across his face. "I just wanted you to know," he said softly, "last night wasn't all a lie. I did care." I met his eyes, searching for the sincerity I'd missed before. "Maybe it was there, maybe not. You can't build something real on deceit," I said. "Even if your heart means well." He nodded, eyes lowering. "I know." Outside, the sky hung gray and quiet. The driveway was slick from the rain, the scent of wet earth heavy in the air. As I loaded my bag into the car, Ryan appeared on the porch. "You're really leaving?" he called out that I didn't look at him. "You got what you wanted. You made me feel something." He didn't answer. Maybe he couldn't. That I started the car, the engine breaking the silence that had settled over everything. For a moment, I glanced in the rearview mirror, Ryan still standing there, Leo behind him, both of them framed by the doorway like a memory I was trying to escape. As I drove away, the reflection faded, replaced by the open road stretching ahead. The voice in my mind, the one that used to whisper doubt, was quiet now, replaced by something clearer, harder that I had trusted them, and they had crossed a line I didn't even know existed. But maybe, in that betrayal, I'd found something unexpected, a reminder that I could still feel anger, hurt, and the will to move forward. Sometimes, healing doesn't come from kindness. Sometimes, it comes from walking away. That I didn't glance back again, but as the rain began to fall once more, I couldn't help thinking of Ryan's final words. "You'll understand one day." Maybe I would. Just not today. The morning unfolded in soft, reluctant light. The city outside was already awake, cars moving, people rushing, but inside the quiet hotel room, time felt suspended. Daniel sat at the edge of the bed, his shirt half buttoned, his thoughts scattered like glass. Adrian was still asleep, his breathing even, his expression untroubled. The sheets around him were a tangled confession, one that neither of them had planned to write. For a long while, Daniel simply watched, the silence between them both tender and unbearable. He remembered the night as fragments, words whispered in half-darkness, laughter turned soft, hands that trembled not from desire alone but from recognition. There had been no grand seduction, no manipulation. Only two lonely men standing too close to the truth. Now, with daylight unkindly honest, Daniel felt the sharp edge of consequence. The realization didn't arrive as guilt, it came as clarity. What had happened was not about lust or rebellion, it was about need. The kind that had been starving in him for years. He rose quietly, careful not to wake Adrian. His body moved with mechanical precision, folding his clothes, gathering his watch, checking for his phone. Yet each small motion carried weight, as though every sound might shatter the fragile calm they had created. When he finally looked back, Adrian stirred. "You're leaving." His voice was calm, but there was a softness beneath it, the kind that comes from understanding before hearing an answer. Daniel hesitated. "I have to." Adrian nodded slowly. "I figured." He sat up, running a hand through his hair. "You don't owe me an explanation." "That's the problem," Daniel replied quietly. "I think I do." Adrian studied him, eyes clear but kind. "Then tell me something true before you go." Daniel drew a breath. "Last night, it wasn't wrong because you were a man. It was wrong because I realized how long I've been living without feeling anything at all." Adrian didn't respond immediately. He reached out, resting a hand on the bed between them, a gesture of presence, not possession. "Maybe that's the truest thing you've said." Daniel managed a faint smile. "Maybe." He left before the weight of hesitation could root him there. The hallway felt colder than before, the elevator painfully slow. By the time he stepped into the lobby, the ordinary world had resumed, phones ringing, heels clicking, voices rising and fading. Everything was normal again, except him. Outside, the air was crisp. He walked toward the parking lot, each step deliberate, his thoughts circling the same quiet question, what now? His phone buzzed, a message from Laura, "Miss you. Hope the meetings went well. Dinner tonight?" He read it twice, then typed back a simple, "Yes." His fingers hovered over the screen, tempted to add more, to explain something he himself didn't yet understand. But he didn't. Some truths, he knew, couldn't survive translation. The drive home was long and unremarkable. The world moved as it always had, billboards flashing, radios humming, sunlight bleeding across the windshield. And yet, Daniel felt as though he were seeing everything through new glass. The distance between who he had been and who he was now felt immeasurable. When he finally walked into his apartment, Laura greeted him with a smile that had once meant everything. She kissed his cheek and began talking about work, clients, plans for the weekend. Her voice filled the room with normalcy, but he heard the spaces between her words, the quiet indifference neither of them had dared name. Later, when she fell asleep beside him, Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He wasn't haunted by Adrian's face or touch, but by the silence that followed, an emptiness that now felt honest instead of hollow. That he thought of Adrian's parting words, "Tell me something true." The phrase lingered like a prayer. In the following weeks, life resumed its rhythm. Meetings, meals, polite laughter. But something within Daniel had shifted irreversibly. He began to write again, small reflections, fragments of thought he couldn't share aloud. In one entry, dated quietly in his journal, he wrote, "I once believed infidelity was a choice. Now I think it's sometimes a symptom, of hunger, of silence, of living too long unseen." He closed the notebook and stared out the window, where the city lights flickered against the dark. That he didn't text Adrian, though he thought about it more than once. Some connections, he realized, weren't meant to be revisited, they were meant to reveal. As days blurred into weeks, Daniel found himself more aware of small things, the texture of morning light, the way Laura's voice softened when she said his name, the quiet ache of moments that almost felt like love. He wasn't absolved, but he was awake. One night, while standing on the balcony, he whispered to the night air, "Thank you," though he wasn't sure to whom. Perhaps to Adrian, perhaps to the version of himself he had finally met in that hotel room. For the first time in years, Daniel didn't feel empty. He felt unfinished, and that, he thought, might be enough. Weeks turned into months, and the rhythm of Daniel's life returned, at least on the surface. He went to work, attended meetings, came home to Laura, and played his role with quiet precision. Yet beneath that practiced normalcy, something fragile had shifted. It wasn't guilt that followed him, it was awareness. A new sensitivity to every silence, every glance, every word left unsaid. He began to notice how often people spoke without meaning anything, how routine had become a refuge for those afraid to feel. He recognized it in himself most of all. Some nights, while Laura slept beside him, Daniel would stare into the dim glow of the ceiling and replay that night in the hotel, the stillness, the warmth, the honesty. He did not crave a repetition of it. What he longed for was the version of himself who had dared, even for one night, to be real. At work, colleagues began to remark that he seemed quieter, more deliberate. He smiled at the comment but offered no explanation. His silence was not withdrawal, it was listening. For the first time, he was paying attention to the life he had built and wondering whether it had ever truly belonged to him. One afternoon, while cleaning the drawers of his desk, Daniel found a small folded note. At first, he didn't recognize it. Then he saw the handwriting, Adrian's. Simple, elegant. "Tell me something true." He had forgotten he'd slipped it into his bag that morning before leaving the hotel. The paper had yellowed slightly, but the words felt newly written. That night, he sat by the window, the note resting in his palm. Outside, the city lights pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. Laura was out of town for a conference, and the apartment was silent except for the hum of distant traffic. He took out his journal, the one he'd been filling with small confessions since that morning after. He wrote slowly, as if carving truth into the page, "I met someone who reminded me what it means to see and be seen. It wasn't love. It wasn't desire. It was recognition, raw, inconvenient, and necessary." He paused, the pen hovering above the paper, then continued. "Maybe infidelity isn't about betrayal but about the moment we finally admit what our lives have become. Maybe we cheat not on people, but on our own numbness." When he finished writing, he folded the page carefully and tucked it beside Adrian's note. The act felt ceremonial, as though he were sealing away something sacred, not to forget, but to understand. Days later, Laura returned. She was radiant from her trip, full of stories and laughter. Daniel listened, smiling, though part of him stood apart, observing. When she placed her hand over his and said, "I missed this," he didn't pull away. He squeezed back, gently, meaning it in a way that surprised him. That night, they ate dinner by candlelight for the first time in months. Conversation came easier. Laughter filled the spaces where silence once lived. Laura spoke about wanting to travel together again, to revisit the places where they used to dream. Daniel nodded. "I'd like that," he said, and he meant it, but when she stepped away to clear the dishes, his eyes caught the faint reflection of himself in the window, older, wiser, more uncertain than before. He realized then that no reconciliation could erase what had changed within him. The experience with Adrian had not broken his marriage, it had illuminated it. A week later, Daniel received an email from an unfamiliar address. No words, just an image, a skyline at dawn, pale and quiet. Beneath it, a single line, "Be kind to yourself." No signature. No expectation. Just closure. He read it twice, then smiled, a quiet ache settling in his chest. Later that evening, he stood on the balcony with a cup of tea, watching the city lights flicker against the dark. Laura's laughter drifted from the kitchen. The world, it seemed, had moved on. But Daniel knew he carried something within him now that time could not dilute, a memory not of infidelity, but of awakening. He whispered softly into the cool air, "Thank you, Adrian." It wasn't a confession. It was gratitude, for the mirror held up to his emptiness, for the courage it took to face it, and for the man he was slowly becoming because of it. Inside, Laura called his name, her voice warm and familiar. Daniel turned, setting the cup aside. As he stepped inside, the lights reflected briefly across the glass, two figures merging into one, past and present, mistake and meaning, all converging quietly into something almost whole. For the first time in a long while, Daniel didn't feel like he was pretending to live. He was, at last, simply living.